with trumpets sound. Oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne.
Have you ever been on a Burma trail? This is an activity often inflicted upon children at school camps, where they're blindfolded like these two children and have to navigate their way around an obstacle course with nothing but a rope with which to guide them. When I was leading youth groups, I did something similar with young people, but without the rope. We set up an obstacle course in a back room with church pews to climb over and bars to duck under, along with other obstacles. We would then bring the youth in blindfolded, one at a time, and have them work their way around the course without being able to see where they were going. We, of course, put some safety procedures in place. An unblindfolded person was always within reaching distance, ready to ensure that these young people didn't hurt themselves. At first, no one spoke to these young people other than to tell them what their task was, to work their way to the other end of the room where the exit was, and that they couldn't take their blindfold off. The young people would hesitate before going anywhere, but knowing that they were being timed and that there was a prize for the person navigating the course in the quickest time meant that they all eventually started feeling their way cautiously around the course. Having got partway through, a designated person would then start to give them helpful directions and warnings, telling them what they needed to do and what obstacles they were about to encounter. Their speed and their confidence both naturally and noticeably increased. Finally, we had a couple of other people start chirping in with their comments, causing a distraction and trying to confuse the blindfolded person. Those who concentrated on the voice of the initial helper and who filtered out the other false instructions made it through to the exit easily. A debrief discussion was held after all the youth had gone through. Some successful, some less so. No one was injured as far as I can recall. So why did we do this? Apart from the sheer fun of inflicting young people with crazy ideas and tasks, we did it because we wanted to simulate the need for faith in real life situations for them. We all are going through life encountering obstacles that will sooner or later threaten to trip us up. We need direction. We need direction given from someone trustworthy, someone we can put our trust and our faith in. There will always be other voices, ones that we could choose to listen to instead, ones who would potentially lead us astray and cause us to stumble. We need to filter out those distracting voices and to center in on following the one true voice. We may know the big picture, get to the other end of the room and exit, but it's the smaller steps that we don't always know. And the smaller steps that make up the bigger picture is where we need to find that true voice that will guide us safely through to the end. I think that night the lights went on for some of our youth. They shared how daunting it was initially, not knowing which direction to go, where safety was, where danger lay. They shared how comforting it was to hear a voice giving them directions, looking out for them, warning them of danger. Someone they learned that they could put their trust in and rely on. They also talked about those other voices, questioning whether they were the ones they should have followed, and the safety of keeping to follow the one who had already proven to be faithful. Abraham and Sarah, his wife, had their own real life experiences similar to this, not blindfolded, but not knowing where they were going, learning to put their trust in one voice, the voice of God. They follow on from the story of Abel and Noah in the list of heroes of faith recorded for us in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through to 16. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed God when called to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner, living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise, and so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. All these people died still believing that what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they had come from, they could have gone back, but they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It must have been like setting out on a journey, following the directions of your GPS navigation system in your car, without any idea of the end destination, where it was leading you to, just taking you one step at a time, but to where? Abraham and Sarah put their faith in God, that he was taking them to a place worth persevering to get to. And so they set out, leaving the family behind, leaving their security of home and family for the unknown. That's faith. Blind faith? No, because they knew the one directing them was faithful and true, a voice to be followed that could be trusted, though they couldn't see the big picture, even though they had a promise that seemed too impossible to be realized. That's faith, but not blind faith, which is based on wishful thinking, indicating that or believing that the voice they're following was trustworthy. What were these promises they claimed by faith? By being obedient to God, to leave their home and go to a land that God would show them. Verse 10 tells us Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. And then in verse 12, that God had promised his descendants would be numerous. A nation, so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. So Sarah and Abraham stepped out in obedient faith and started a journey towards their promised destiny. Listen as we hear of the journey of faith and belief in the impossible. Read for us from Genesis chapter 18, starting at verse 1 and going through to verse 15, followed by chapter 21, verses 1 through to 7.
The Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." "All right," they said. "Do as you have said." So Abraham ran back to the tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and the roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the visitors asked. "She's inside the tent," Abraham replied. Then one of them said, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, "How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, 'Can an old woman like me have a baby?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh." But the Lord said, "No, you did laugh." The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God had said it would, and Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah declared, "God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me." Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age.
Abraham stepped out in faith, going to the place that God had promised him, but his faith was less than perfect. When we compare the Genesis 12 verses 1 to 5 account with Acts chapter 7 verses 2 to 4, it becomes evident that Abraham at first only went halfway to where God was calling him, before he stopped and resided there for a length of time. But he eventually did fully obey God's call. When Abraham did finally enter the land God had promised, they lived there as sojourners, never owning any part of the land except for the plots that he and Sarah were eventually buried in. The word translated in Hebrews chapter 11 as dwelt is the ancient Greek word paroikos, which describes a resident alien, one who lives somewhere but doesn't have permanent status there. David Guzik suggests a resident alien or a sojourner is characterized by the way they talk, the way they dress, their mannerisms, their entertainment, their citizenship, and their friends all speak of their native home. If someone, however, is the same in all these areas as a people native to the land where they're living in, they are no longer sojourners. They are permanent residents. Guzik goes on to say that as Christians, we shouldn't live as if we're permanent residents of planet Earth, but as if our home is with God in heaven. Because they had no permanent home, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lived in tents instead of in permanent houses. But they looked forward to a better city, a city which has foundations, whose builder is and maker is God. As the Genesis text that has just been read to us begins, Abraham is found on a hot day, sitting in the opening of his tent. He is approached by 3 strangers, men whom Abraham recognizes as being important and worthy of honor. We can assume that this group includes God in the person of Jesus Christ, appearing to Abraham before Jesus' incarnation and birth at Bethlehem. We can assume this because of God the Father. Scriptures tells us no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with God the Father, who has made him known. John 1:18. So, if God appeared to anyone in human form recorded in the Old Testament, and no one has seen God the Father, it makes sense the appearances of the eternal Son, the second person of the Trinity. We don't know if Abraham immediately recognized who these visitors were, even though the Lord had, in the person of Jesus Christ, appeared to Abraham twice before, recorded in Genesis 12:7 and 17 verse 1. We don't know if Jesus looked the same each time, or if Abraham could just know who he was. Abraham, however, ran from the tent door to meet them. And in keeping with the customs and the culture of his day, Abraham proceeded to offer hospitality to these travellers. It took time to prepare and to serve a meal. And during this time, one of the three guests inquired of Abraham, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" "She's inside the tent," was the reply. To which one of them then went on, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son." We read that Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. We're also told that both Abraham and Sarah were very old by this time, and that Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed, not out loud so anyone could hear her, but silently to herself, and said, "How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old?" Sarah is right. What was being suggested was impossible, humanly speaking. Then we read, "The Lord said to Abraham," Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, "Can an old woman like me have a baby?" He couldn't have heard her, but he miraculously knew. He goes on to ask, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" The answer is obvious to us. No, nothing is too hard for God. He proceeded to repeat what he had said, what he had foretold. "I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened just at the time God had said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. God delivered on his promise, as he always does. It seems to me that God set this whole scenario up to prove his faithfulness, to test Abraham's faith and Sarah's faith, to stretch their faith to its limits. Early in their lives, God makes them a promise. "I will make you, your descendants, a great nation that is numerous in number." But he doesn't fulfill that promise until both Abraham and Sarah are old and past childbearing age. Then he acts, making the impossible a reality. We read in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11, "It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise." She may have laughed at the prospect when told in her old age that the following year she would have a child. But she believed God. She believed he would do the impossible and fulfill his promise. Verse 12 says, "And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead." A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. We need to believe in the impossible, to have faith that everything God says he will do, he will do. Step out in faith, trusting the God who does the impossible.
It matters why we do this. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus broke bread. He gave it to his disciples. Take and eat. This is my body.
He took a cup. Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood. It is poured out for many, for the forgiveness of sin.
It matters how we do this. Let each of us look at our lives. Let us recognize our sin. Let us see the grace of God in the body and blood of Christ, broken for us, poured out for our forgiveness.
It matters that we do this. Let us eat the bread, drink from the cup. Remember the Lord's death in our place on the cross, while looking for his return.